can start giving introduction. Dubey sir, please.
Okay. Amresh, you can unmute yourself. Good morning, friends. It's a pleasure to be back again on this Sunday. And we have with us today Mr. Amresh Kumar. And I'm really thankful to Amresh ji for accepting our invitation to be here today and talk to this group. Amresh ji doesn't need an introduction, but I'll briefly introduce him to people who perhaps don't know him. Amresh ji is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation India. He has been principal of Rajghat School, Rajghat Basic School, and also Sahyadri School. Presently, he is in Sahyadri. I want to extend a very warm welcome to Amresh ji. And he is going to talk to us on awakening of intelligence. Amresh ji has also sent a synopsis of his talk, which you will recall I had circulated along with the notice of the talk. I hope some of us had time to read it. Amresh ji, as the tradition here has been, you can take as long as you want, but perhaps about 50 to 60 minutes, followed by question and answer session. So with these words, I want to thank Amresh ji once again and will request him to begin his talk. Amresh ji, please.
Thank you, Dubey ji. I'll share my screen so that I think when I share the screen, are you able to see the screen and the video on the side or only the screen?
Only the screen.
I see. Let me see if I can try something else. Just give me a couple of minutes to sort this out.
Yeah, sure.
Can you now see the screen, the slide as well as the video, or only the slide?
I think we can only see the slide.
Okay.
But Amresh ji, it may be a good idea to show the videos separately, perhaps. That would be easier, I guess. But I don't know.
I'm not very sure how to go about doing that.
If you see the screen, there is a, I mean, like you are sharing the PowerPoint, you can also share the videos by hitting that.
One second. Sorry, just give me one more minute and I should be able to come up with something.
Sure, sure. Please.
I think this will be the best I can probably manage. You can see the video as well as the screen now?
Yes, sir. We are able to see the PPT presentation and your video.
Yes, okay. So that is, okay. For the time being, I think let us try to work with this.
Right, sir.
All right. Okay, good morning to everyone. Today I'd like to talk to you about some of the questions and challenges involved in the educational work of the Krishnamurti schools. I hope we will be able to have a meaningful exchange based on questions you may have after the talk. In my synopsis for this talk, which is entitled Awakening Intelligence, I had indicated what you would all be familiar with, that Krishnamurti's teachings point to the possibility of a radical transformation in the consciousness of humanity. Also broadly familiar to you may be the intent of the Krishnamurti schools. These schools are not meant merely for students to acquire academic knowledge and prepare for a career. Their intent is to investigate what it means to awaken the intelligence of the student through self-knowledge. To put it differently, in a fundamental sense, the case schools are meant to deeply explore what it means to live harmoniously and without conflict. The essence of such a conflict-free existence is conveyed beautifully by Krishnamurti's metaphor of a skilled boatman. I quote, "Yesterday evening, I saw a boat going up the river at full sail, driven by the west wind. It was a large boat, heavily laden with firewood for the town. The sun was setting, and this boat against the sky was astonishingly beautiful. The boatman was just guiding it. There was no effort, for the wind was doing all the work. Similarly, if each one of us could understand the problem of struggle and conflict, then I think we would be able to live effortlessly, happily, with a smile on our face." I feel that Krishnamurti's descriptions of nature, as well as his encounters with people, are like paintings that evoke the essence of his meaning. It seems to me that the boatman is just guiding the boat by effortlessly moving the sails, even though the boat is heavily laden with firewood. Perhaps the boatman too absorbs the beauty of the evening because he is skilled at manipulating the sails of his boat, and therefore not in conflict with the wind nor the waters of the river. If we could learn how to just guide the movement of our own inner lives without effort, as it were, then we would come upon a fundamental truth about life, that it is possible to live without conflict. Krishnamurti's indication to us is obvious and often made explicit in his talks and writings. If we do not have the skills to navigate without effort and conflict the waters of our life, then we should learn what it means to do so. He says, "The mind is such an extraordinary thing. You spend 18 or 20 years learning the same subjects and passing several examinations, but you do not spend an hour or even 10 minutes to understand this extraordinary thing called the mind. Without understanding the mind, passing examinations, getting jobs, or you're becoming a minister has very little meaning. It is the mind that creates illusions. And if you do not understand the maker of illusions, your life has little meaning. Looking at the state of the world, the looming devastations of climate change, the prospect of an extended war in Europe, the rise of authoritarian governments worldwide, and the deeply alienating impact of digital technologies, especially on young lives. Looking at all of this, living without conflict with nature, with people, and within oneself is surely the most urgent necessity on the planet. And although this may well be an impossible challenge to meet fully, this is the intent of the K schools. What is the secret then, or the mystery of it? How do we go about nurturing a new generation of young minds who will not be swayed by a self-obsessed, divisive, and corrupt society? What is to be the scope of our inquiry? What is to be the scope of our investigation into the mind and its hidden roots in division and violence? And what does it look like, this education that will enable young people to live without conflict? As I said in my synopsis for this talk, the central factor in this inquiry into the human mind is self-knowledge. And nurturing self-knowledge is the intent of the K schools. It is to be understood for the purpose of my talk that awakening intelligence in children, nurturing self-knowledge, and enabling young minds to discover a harmonious life without any conflict are different ways of saying the same thing, or at least there is a large overlap in their meanings. Let me repeat those three phrases that I say have similar or very close meanings. One is the awakening of intelligence in children. The nurturing of self-knowledge is the second one. And enabling young minds to live without conflict. These three phrases I take to be similar in meaning. They are not exactly the same, but have a large overlap in terms of their content, but also their implications for education in school. To understand the work of the Krishnamurti schools with reference to self-knowledge, let me take up these three questions and explore each of them in turn. First, how should we approach the child in order to understand him? And who is the child? What is his inner makeup, both his natural inclinations and his conditioning? Then, second, what is the nature of self-knowledge? And thirdly, what is involved in nurturing self-knowledge in the context of a K school? How to understand the child? In this section, I'd like to first talk about the educator's approach in relating with the child before sketching a portrait of the child. When the potter throws the clay on the potter's wheel, he must first center it in order to do his work gracefully. It is not enough to have the clay. He must create the right conditions first before he can do his work. In a similar way, the educator must first adopt the right stance towards the child by relating with him first as a human being. Only then would it be worthwhile for him to look at who the child is to enable his learning in specific areas or specific ways. In meeting the child in this whole endeavor to rightly educate him, Krishnamurti has always been emphatic that there be no fear of punishment in the child, nor any desire in the educator to enforce obedience and conformity. Understanding the child as a whole is central to the work of the educator. Krishnamurti says, to understand a child, we have to watch him at play, study him in his different moods, We cannot project upon him our own prejudices, hopes, and fears, or mold him to fit the pattern of our desires. If we are constantly judging the child according to our personal likes and dislikes, we are bound to create barriers and hindrances in our relationship with him and in his relationships with the world. Every child is unique, and taken as a whole, it is therefore impossible to measure him as a human being or to compare him with other children. In school, however, there is a constant stream of evaluation of the child's academic performance as well as his general behavior in the light of school expectations and norms. This is obviously relevant. Krishnamurti is simple and direct about the need for such evaluations and the need for conformity at this level, but only in this superficial sense, not in the deeper aspect of our existence as human beings. He says, conformity, adjustment, adaptability superficially is necessary, but inwardly, deeply, conformity brings about effort and therefore imitation. And so it is really crucial to understand where the evaluative stance is necessary and where it must be dropped. When the educator relates to the child as a non-fragmented, total human being, he enters into a non-evaluative stance. This is what Krishnamurti says about what I'm calling the non-evaluative stance. The ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence. I think it is one of the greatest challenges in the Krishnamurti school to inculcate among teachers this non-evaluative stance, as well as the capacity to swiftly switch between the two stances, the evaluative stance and the non-evaluative stance. Let me for a moment hark back to the skilled boatman in my first quote from Krishnamurti. It seems to me that the skilled educator who can swiftly switch between the evaluative stance and the non-evaluative stance is able to effortlessly and without conflict guide the student, like the skilled boatman just guiding the boat effortlessly without conflict with the wind and the waters of the river. There is another dimension to this capacity of the educator in understanding the child. This has to do with the educator's capacity for what I call moral imagination. To be able to construct ways of looking at the child so as to make sense of his speech and behavior in the light of who he is as a growing individual, as well as a human being, is an immense challenge. It is also one of the greatest joys of being an educator. It seems to me that most educational shortcomings arise because of the poverty of the adult's moral imagination, be he educator or parent. The poverty of the adult's moral imagination results in their incapacity in understanding the child. I must hasten to add that the application of one's moral imagination, as I have been talking about it, seems to remain always somewhat elusive because it really demands the involvement of the whole of one's being, intellectual capacity, empathic listening, and also a childlike playfulness. Yet, if kept at the heart of the educator's intent, it is profoundly enriching. rewarding, and liberating for the educator. The use of moral imagination, which comes from a non-evaluative stance, is essential in school if we are to nurture self-knowledge in the child. We will return to this in a different form a little later when we take up the third question on the nurturing of self-knowledge. Let us now consider who the child is, the child who comes to the school to be educated. What is his psychological makeup? We can perhaps look at the child's capacities, inclinations, and inner life in 4 different aspects. His innate qualities and natural inclinations, his family background, his life as a teenager, and the influence of contemporary factors upon him. I have here now 4 slides where I have listed these 4 different aspects, 4 different ways of considering the child's life and reality, and put a cluster of different qualities and aspects of the child's life for our consideration, just to create briefly a portrait which is, as you will see, complex. And this, of course, is not a full portrait, it's rather partial, but it will give us a flavor and allow us to connect with who the child is. So the innate qualities of the child first. The child has curiosity, spontaneity, a natural affection for others, empathy, which is the capacity to see things from others' point of view, an interest in learning, playfulness, forgiveness, listening without prejudice or interpretation because of their innocence, feeling strongly and experiencing a passion for things. This is perhaps more pronounced in teenagers. And the need for security. And perhaps in a very profound way, the need for autonomy, the need to make one's own discoveries, to comprehend life, to grow, to do things in a way that is integrated into his own being, not merely borrowed. And so children from a very young age, unless they are already smothered by the adults around them, will protest if you try to solve a problem for them. They would rather do it on their own. I think that is something that is a whole issue in itself, deserving of a separate conversation, the need for the child's autonomy. Next is the background of the child. In this are the beliefs and attitudes towards various kinds of people, class, caste, religion, identification of other kinds with various roles that the child sees his parents occupy. A social morality referring to all manner of things that are absorbed from society, including relationship to authority, obedience to teachers, parents, other elders, the adoption of role models, the drive to be like a star, a rock star, or a sports star, or the best child in the class. The idea that being good is important. The belief of some kind, an imitative belief that you have to be good, you should be good. Being successful. The idea that the purpose of life is to grow up to be happy and successful by finding your place in society. This is, again, one of the fundamental attitudes, a very basic, deep-set attitude in children. And most children have this. They come into school in a different environment, and this aspect of their social conditioning leads them, even though they have experienced a different environment and engaged with questions and met challenges of critical thought and conversation, they may have the tendency, born out of fear, to conform to this idea that they must fit into society, be successful by finding their place in it. Growing up includes finding one's place in the peer group, which involves the development of various social skills, discovering who you are, personal identity. This is the word personal identity, the phrase I'm using not in the sense of being conditioned through identification with a particular kind of self-image, but a discovery of who they actually are in their various capacities, their urges. It's an evolving, growing, dynamic movement of development in the child as they are growing up. Of course, along with it, there is also the identification with self-image of various kinds, but I'm in the use of personal identity here, I mean a somewhat more developmentally necessary progression in the child's inner life. Then there is sexuality and sexual identity, which is a major factor in the lives of children in these times. Romantic attachment can be a very powerful drive as well. And then there is intellectual development, which begins to emerge once the child has reached the age of 13 or 14 or a little before perhaps, which involves entering into the world of the disciplines, a hunger perhaps that the child may discover to delve deeper, the discovery of what they love to do because they enjoy studying something. Then there's the negotiating of schedules and relationships, which is a great challenge for adolescents often. The need for sleep, risk-taking behavior, rebelliousness, and cynicism. Finally, these contemporary influences and factors, which includes the addiction to electronic gadgets and social media. There is isolation and the vast onset of anxiety, depression, and self-harm that has emerged like this dark cloud that hangs over this generation. It is truly extraordinary. I don't know if you are aware of this, but this has escalated alarmingly over the last 2 decades or so, especially in the West. This onset of anxiety, depression, loneliness, self-harm, and suicidal tendencies. And interestingly, something that one has to still understand, risk-taking behavior, which used to be associated with the adolescent years, has reduced over the same time period. One wonders why this is so, but it's quite possible that the young child who comes to the age of 10, 12, 13, whatever it is, begins to become aware of the world and is deeply anxious in some unnamable way about the way the world is, the impending disasters that he reads about in the news, he or she, I'm just using he for ease of communication, that he reads in the news. And there is the moral distress of having come into the world where he feels helpless. Maybe he sees the adults around him being helpless, perhaps. And there's then the moral distress of feeling for something, feeling a concern, really caring for something, but not being able to do anything about it. I think for young people, this must be a very big factor. This then is the child who is with us, inherently curious and inwardly alive, capable of spontaneity, responsive to the world around him, but also conditioned by social morality, weighed down somewhat, roughly between the ages of 12 and 17, by hormonal changes and the challenges of growing up. And finally, increasingly encumbered by the onslaught of emerging technologies that strive to capture more and more of his attention. This is the ground of children's lives. But every child is different, and it is necessary for the educator to be somewhat aware of these factors and understand their interrelationships so that he may be better equipped to understand a particular child. It is part of this work of building a capacity for moral imagination in understanding children's behavior, not to respond to behavior with the intention to ensure compliance, conformity, but to understand what the sources of his behavior, where they may lie. And unless there is an active engagement with this complex portrait that I have partially sketched, the educator's responses may be very shallow and not able to meet the actual need in the child. I've discussed our approach in relating with children so far and in our approach to understand them, in understanding them. And I've sketched a fairly complex but still partial portrait of what the child is. Let us now turn to the second of the three questions I had posed. What is the nature of self-knowledge? We said earlier that self-knowledge can bring about a harmonious state that is free of conflict. This way of thinking can make it seem that a conflict-free life is a desirable end to be achieved. And self-knowledge is the means to that end. The same way of thinking can also make self-knowledge a desirable end, something to be achieved in order to achieve a conflict-free life. But self-knowledge is not an end. It is the ongoing awareness of the movement of consciousness. Nor can the peace and happiness of a conflict-free existence be achieved directly or by deliberate effort. Let us discuss this a bit. If self-knowledge is not an end, what should be our attitude to it? Usually, we function in the field of causation. And so our intentions, our feelings and actions are all governed by means to ends thinking. Say we have to go from A to B in physical space or in carrying out a project like building a bridge. To reach B, to achieve that end, we have to necessarily rely on the knowledge we have about the world to go from A to B. In fact, not relying on knowledge may have disastrous consequences and fairly predictable ones, both physically and psychologically. Physically, you could lose your job, and psychologically, you may incur the disapproval of the people who depend on you to take them from A to B, and so on. Throughout our experience as a child and in the long years of growing into adulthood, this reliance on knowledge to achieve ends is deeply absorbed by our minds. You could think of it as a systemic habit, an inward orientation that affects the whole of the mind. The whole of the mind, which is embodied in the associative connections in the brain responsible for thought and feeling, is aligned with this systemic habit of means to ends thinking. No one explicitly teaches us to follow this strategy. It is not required to be taught because the brain itself arrives at this systemic habit as a survival strategy and applies it to all aspects of its existence, both the physical and the psychological. Now, the journey into self-knowledge is supposed to lead the inquirer to a state where he experiences the absence of the problem he had begun with. The problem being the conflict in daily life. The inquirer will presumably move from the experience of a conflict to the experience of its resolution somehow. Put this way, it appears that the absence of conflict arrived at through self-knowledge is the end we are seeking. And so we must undertake the journey to such a state, do whatever is required to go from A, the state of conflict, to B, the state of peace and happiness. Perhaps we will need to prepare for this journey, put together strategies, and bolster our strength of will to face the challenges along the path. We may perhaps have to make a great deal of effort to achieve this goal. And in this vein, the mind that is deeply conditioned to the systemic habit of means to ends thinking can go on like a broken record, moving in its rut, striving and failing over and over again. Does this mean that all effort is meaningless? Krishnamurti's words may come to mind to somebody who's at least beginning to inquire into this. It may not apply to us, but it's something that may occur to a child in school, hence my lingering with this. Krishnamurti's words may come to mind in this context. Truth is a pathless land. There is no fixed path, one might think. Indeed, there is no path at all, since the first step is the last step. This seems paradoxical. Are we to arrive at peace and happiness simply by taking a single step, or no step at all, by making no effort? Not only does this interpretation of Krishnamurti's words seem paradoxical, it also seems meaningless. It's as if we have been cheated out of our interest in self-knowledge. It is also perhaps confusing and disorienting for a person who encounters Krishnamurti first to hear that effort is the very essence of conflict. Isn't some work necessary? Surely, no effort does not mean no attention to the problem of self-knowledge and no engagement with oneself. No, of course it doesn't. What then is the nature of this attention to the problem of self-knowledge and this engagement with oneself? Krishnamurti points to the hard work we have to do with ourselves. He says here, so happiness, I think, is something that cannot be pursued any more than you can pursue peace. If you pursue peace, your mind becomes stagnant. For peace is a living state. And to understand what peace is requires a great deal of intelligence and hard work. Not merely sitting down and wishing for peace. Similarly, happiness requires immense understanding, insight, and hard work. As much hard work as you give to earning a livelihood, and far more. But if you are merely seeking happiness, then you might just as well take a drug. The hard work in this inquiry seems to involve engaging with questions, grappling with oneself and examining one's motives, reactions, and tendencies. Asking oneself in all earnestness what right relationship means, what it means to live a balanced life, and so on. Included in this portrait of hard work is an aspect that is deeply challenging at a personal level, as it must inevitably be, I think. Krishnamurti says, true relationship is really a state in which you are constantly in a process of understanding yourself in relation to something. That is, relationship is a process of self-revelation. And that self-revelation is very painful because in relationship, you soon find yourself out if you are open to discover it. So there is indeed work to be done, the work of engaging with questions about oneself and the observation of oneself in the mirror of relationship. And I think there is a still deeper challenge that Krishnamurti often returns to, that of facing one's own loneliness. Most people are constantly occupied with something, with puja, with the repetition of certain words, with worrying over this or that, because they are frightened to be alone with themselves. You try being alone without any form of distraction, and you will see how quickly you want to get away from yourself and forget what you are. That is why this enormous structure of professional amusement, of automated distraction, is so prominent a part of what we call civilization. These three themes then seem to stand out in our attempt to answer the question, what is self-knowledge? Asking questions and inquiring into one's motives, reactions, and tendencies, observing oneself in the mirror of relationship, and learning to remain with loneliness. There is one more strand in this investigation into the nature of self-knowledge that I would like to explore a little further, because elusive though it may be, I think it is as beautiful an aspect of this inquiry as it seems forbidding, to me at least. Remaining with loneliness is not easy. Why? Because one is most likely to experience boredom sitting by oneself, doing nothing. But boredom is perhaps merely a symptom of the self-isolating experience of loneliness. The root of loneliness may lie much deeper in some nameless fear, not in the easily recognizable conscious fears. A full encounter with the root of loneliness can seem all too overwhelming and perhaps even life-threatening for some. Krishnamurti suggests that we can understand our unconscious fear and find release from it through affection. To find out what is implied in the cessation of effort, I must find out whether fear can come to an end, totally, not partially. I may not be consciously afraid of anything, but deeply I'm afraid. So in the unconscious, there is fear, and to understand it, not consciously. You can't understand anything deliberately. You must come to it sensitively, with a freshness, with an eagerness, with an intensity. That is, you must come to it with affection, with love. Then only you'll understand something. I think that when we speak of the art of living, the art of listening, the art of observation, wherever the word art appears in these phrases, the freshness, the eagerness, and the intensity of affection are rather important. Perhaps genuine affection is essential. Without it, one's journey into self-knowledge may remain at the level of the intellect, marked by ignorance of one's own conditioning, untested by the challenges of self-revelation in relationship, and trapped in the self-deception of an unconscious hypocrisy. Affection is also important because when it is genuine, I feel it is an essential part of humility. And this is very much a very tentative exploration which I'd like to present to you for your consideration. Affection without humility may be a form of attachment. That is why affection, interpreted as sentiment, is a tricky matter in the context of listening to Krishnamurti talking about affection. It may not be the case that Krishnamurti has in mind the easily experienced sentiments that we normally call affection. So I use the word affection here, somewhat tentatively, more in order to explore and continue to explore and understand, rather than as any kind of conclusion. Affection without humility may be a form of attachment. I'll say this again. Affection without humility may be a form of attachment, a mask for one's vanity. And humility without affection may be a pretense, a form of self-deception, and another form of vanity. The humility of genuine affection, whatever that may be, it is really for us to explore this. The humility of genuine affection seems to be essential to the art of observing without distortion, without which self-knowledge may not be possible. We've considered our approach so far to understanding the child. We've looked at a portrait of who the child is, and we've now discussed the nature, to some extent, some aspects of the nature of self-knowledge. Let me put together the main strands we've explored. The first was the non-evaluative stance and a well-developed capacity for moral imagination are essential in understanding the child. Not to judge the child, the educator has to work with himself, to observe his own tendencies, to interpret, to put the child into one category or another category, to find out what it means to have this non-evaluative stance, as I spoke about, and also to have an active moral imagination, to actively try to understand where the child is, to consider his background, to relate with him in this particular way that he has grown up, his history, and so on. Next is self-knowledge, which requires these four, not requires, but for which these four aspects seem relevant. Asking questions and inquiring into one's motives, reactions, and tendencies. Observing oneself in the mirror of relationship. Learning to remain with loneliness. Uncovering the root of loneliness with affection. Affection in the sense that we have tentatively talked about, not affection as sentiment, but perhaps something subtler and perhaps more elusive that one has to work with to arrive at. Now, what is involved in nurturing self-knowledge? Let me begin to answer this question by first setting aside what undermines self-knowledge. So we are on a third question now. The first question was, how do we approach the child in understanding him? And along with it, we presented a portrait of the child. The second question we took up was, what is the nature of self-knowledge, and had explored some of those aspects. And the third one now is, what is involved in nurturing self-knowledge? And what I propose to do first is to set aside those aspects of our approach which undermine self-knowledge. Krishnamurti says, unfortunately, most of us desire to shape the child in a way that is gratifying to our own vanities and idiosyncrasies. We find varying degrees of comfort and satisfaction in exclusive ownership and domination. Surely this process is not relationship, but mere imposition. And it is therefore essential to understand the difficult and complex desire to dominate. It takes many subtle forms, and in its self-righteous aspect, it is very obstinate. The desire to serve with the unconscious longing to dominate is difficult to understand. The key phrase for me in this quote is the unconscious longing to dominate. By the way, I should add here that I'm not really saying this as if it can sound like this when one is speaking about these matters, that one is pointing to other people and having observed their shortcomings when he's talking about it. But I really, in each of these, every one of these cases where we have spoken about the limitations in our approach, our identifications, our loneliness, our fears, I'm very much part of that inquiry and don't intend to communicate any of this with any sense that I have a mature or final understanding, or indeed that I'm better placed than any other listener of this talk. Just wanted to clarify that. The key phrase for me is the unconscious longing to dominate. The tendency to dominate is deep in human consciousness. Where it exists, I suspect, it may run much deeper than our affection for colleagues, friends, and family members. One expression of this hidden desire to dominate is the expectation of obedience, as we noted earlier, which is often enforced explicitly through threats and the use of the power that adults have over children. And there are many, many shades that we encounter in our relationship with children as we listen to them about their relationships at home, in their earlier schools, and so on. However, obedience is in direct contradiction to inquiry because it conditions the mind to fear and feelings of insecurity. The child has to be a light unto herself, and this fundamental inward quality is violated and may possibly be destroyed in a dictatorial environment. This doesn't mean that we do away with rules and expectations of reasonable or appropriate conduct, but it is essential to realize that when the teacher becomes narrowly concerned with external order and insists on a strict adherence to rules through an authoritarian stance, a culture of compliance inevitably gets created, which puts an end to any real possibility of an inquiry. Why? I think because the delicate web of relationship which is necessary for a shared inquiry into oneself is destroyed in a climate of control and fear. And this inquiry into self-knowledge is a shared inquiry. In a fundamental aspect, it's not that you yourself, the child himself or herself, is going to explore self-knowledge for some personal gain. It is with working together with others and thinking together with others that one comes upon something. So in that climate of shared inquiry, fear can have no place. There cannot be in the child a cultivation of discontent, which is necessary for inquiry, and the seriousness to inquire deeply when the adult is seen with fear or apprehension. This is perhaps why Krishnamurti has often said that the child must feel absolutely secure at home and in school, so that he's happy. And when there's a question, there is that affectionate, natural affectionate urge in the child that expresses itself in curiosity and inquiry. Sometimes the longing to dominate, that expression in Krishnamurti's quote, can be expressed in an obvious manner. The authoritarian attitude in such cases may be visible to all, whether this is at home with a parent or in school with a teacher. In a Krishnamurti school environment, rarely does the authoritarian attitude consistently manifest in gross or obvious forms, demanding obedience. If it does happen in specific situations, colleagues are often able to give feedback to each other in an impersonal manner and create opportunities for self-reflection. Of course, this can be a challenge sometimes, but there is another kind of challenge which is more subtle and perhaps more deserving of the educator's careful and affectionate attention. This has to do with the fact that the mindset of obedience can be cultivated simply by using words that evoke feelings of status, condemnation, or approval. The use of such words prevents the seeing of things as they are. Any sensitive educator therefore realizes that judgments and the use of words to control children are detrimental to the awakening of their intelligence. This is what Krishnamurti has said about how words can create a barrier to self-knowledge. Watch your own responses and you will see that words like lawyer, business, man, government, servant, love, God have a strange effect on your nerves as well as on your mind. The word which denotes a particular function evokes the feeling of status. So the first thing is to be free of this unconscious habit of associating certain feelings with certain words, is it not? Your mind has been conditioned to think that the term selfish represents something very wrong, unspiritual. And the moment you apply that term to anything, your mind condemns it. If you can look at the facts without feelings of condemnation or approval, you will find that in the very process of looking, there is a dissolution of all the barriers which the mind has erected between itself and the facts. So, in the work of awakening intelligence in school, educators need to have a deep and subtle understanding of what undermines self-knowledge, how the tendency to dominate and the power of words can thwart the movement of self-knowledge in the child from a very early age. Can anything be done to actively nurture self-knowledge? The recent, the last few things I said was about avoiding what undermines self-knowledge, hence the relevance of this question. Can anything be done to actively nurture self-knowledge in school? The answer is yes, but the field seems so vast and many layered that I can only try to say a few things about nurturing one aspect of self-knowledge, the capacity to listen without distortion. As children grow older, their somewhat dormant social conditioning, as well as their memories of personal experience, begin to hold sway. This can come in the way of their listening to each other without distortion, that is, without judgment or prejudice. It may seem that, relatively speaking, they do listen to some of their teachers more openly without judgment or prejudice. This may be true to an extent, especially where a ground of trust and mutual affection has been created between the teacher and the students. However, this quality of engagement seems dependent on that particular history between that teacher and those students. It is born out of a particular relationship. And one may wonder if that capacity to listen without judgment or prejudice is an integral part of the child's being. Can this quality of listening without distortion be inculcated in the child in this integral sense? It seems to me that it can, or perhaps a sound beginning can be made. if there is a sense of urgency in the culture of the school to nurture this capacity through conversation and dialogue, individually and in small groups, the capacity to listen without distortion can be considerably deepened through the values and processes demonstrated in such interactions. Listening without judgment or prejudice may seem to be a matter of the head. After all, judgment and prejudice originate in thought, though they may be accompanied by feelings as well. Does the heart have a place in listening? For Krishnamurti, there is a much deeper quality of attention that goes beyond intellectual discernment and the absence of bias in this intellectual sense. He says, you look without the look of the observer. You look without the value of the word and the measurement of yesterday. The look of love is different from the look of thought. The one leads in a direction where thought cannot follow, and the other leads to separation, conflict, and sorrow. From this sorrow, you cannot go to the other. The distance between the two is made by thought, and thought cannot by any stride reach the other. The look of love is different from the look of thought. I think children know the look of love naturally, instinctively. The way they feel the joyous urgency to go out and play, or the way they are moved by another's pain, or the way they forget their hurt and forgive the one who caused that hurt without even knowing that they have forgiven them. It is an important part of nurturing the child, not only to enable the look of love to flourish, to have its natural existence and its myriad forms of expression, but also to plant the seeds of valuing this look of love. Based on numerous conversations with students in small groups, individually and in small groups over the years, I feel that it is when the head and the heart function together that there is the possibility of serious inquiry. Only then there may be a depth in the asking of a question and the gentle, self-aware resilience of pursuing an inquiry far enough. Krishnamurti says, the quality of seriousness is to pursue to the very end of thought an idea, a feeling, to go to the very end of it, not to be dissuaded by any other factor, to inquire into every thought to the very end of it, whatever may happen to you, even if you have to starve in that process, lose all your property, everything. To go to the very end of thought is to be serious. Seriousness consists in seeing things clearly, in finding out, in not accepting. But later on, when you get married and have children and responsibilities, there is a different kind of seriousness. Then you do not want to break the pattern. You want shelter. You want to live in a safe enclosure, free of all revolutions. Let me put together the two main themes in this section that we have discussed. There is that the adult tendency to dominate and the power of words can thwart the movement of self-knowledge in the child from a very early age. So this aspect needs to be carefully looked at by the educator so that it is negated both individually for the educator and collectively as a school. Then that the capacity to listen without distortion is one of the capacities that can be actively cultivated in school through participation in a culture of conversation and dialogue. The resilience the quality of seriousness, and the capacity for undertaking the hard work needed for understanding and insight in Krishnamurti's sense. All of these are outcomes of right education, which concerns itself fundamentally with the awakening of intelligence. These capacities are cultivated through the honing of the relevant skills as well as a steadiness of the head and the heart, which can be nurtured through immersion in a school culture where the work is already happening. A vibrant culture of conversation marked by listening, drawing out those who hesitate to speak, listening to those who do, honoring those who speak out of courage or vulnerability, and an abiding sense of goodwill are some of the essential ingredients in a school culture that aspires to nurture self-knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Amresh ji. Thanks a lot. Thank you for covering it so beautifully, right from awakening of intelligence to observing the child and to how to bring about self-knowledge. It's a fact that Krishna was very emphatic about the intent of the schools and the basic ideas that he gave. But if one looks in each one of them seriously, one can see they are immeasurable. You can't measure them, but there are indications as to how a person is progressing, especially the child. So I think the responsibility of the educator is much more in a Krishnamurti school compared to any other educational institution. But you have covered it beautifully, so I want to thank you so much for all this. And I see some hands being raised. So before we take up questions, I would request Dr. Gajanan Rao to maybe make a few brief comments, and then we go to Harshad Bhai and Mr. Dinesh Waghmare. Dr. Rao. Sir, unmute yourself. Unmute. Yes.
Thank you, Dubey and Amresh. It's a wonderful talk. So organized. Must have really spent days going through what should come where and very organized. I really request you, rather than comment, to make this a small booklet. I'm not just saying it to think, make people feel you did a great job. No, it is a great job though. So that it could be useful in schools for teachers, educators, as well as grown children, and as well as the study groups. Very useful, sir. I hope
Thank
Krishnamurti Foundation can do that, and if you can provide them a manuscript of this, be very useful, because very difficult to bring the whole lot of things together sequentially like this to make people know what can we do for a better world. It is implied in this. Krishnaji strived for it. The whole world is us, and the world is now what it is. You see it on the papers and on the media every day, how people are dying, houses crumbling, infinite bombing and smoke and stuff. So I suppose I really feel like crying the way we are. And for us to really thoroughly change the adult as well as the young, it required that we do care for what K has said. And today's talk is very, very relevant in that regard. So I'm requesting again, Amresh, to kindly pass it in a form of a manuscript. I will tell the foundation here, take care of somebody, and booklets be sent to various places. Of course, we can go wrong, having been grown the way we've grown and accumulated all that we have, which has thoroughly conditioned us. skill of navigation was a beautiful example. The wind may be making you effortless, but still that skill comes unconsciously to do a little thing here and there, and you're back to the attentive way. So Krishnamurti said that knowing that you're inattentive calls for attention. It's so easy as that. And the schools really, as Dubey pointed out, it's more for teachers. Not that I'm criticizing them, because they suddenly get into, number of them get into schools, okay, and they ought to be having dialogue with their seniors very often to know what it came mean by this, what it came mean by this, what is this understanding of not being this. So I think I have no other comments except saying again, it's been a great morning for me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We can take Harshad Bhai's comments or questions. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. Are you able to hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Amresh. You have spoken quite a bit about so many things like intelligence and self-knowledge and art of listening and discipline, so many things. The awakening of intelligence, I feel that it is very rare, even in educators. No doubt, these schools, Krishnamurti schools, they have a very beautiful environment. There is a nature, lot of space, silence, and nature helps students and teacher to quiet down, to observe, and to have a good relationship. And there is a good relationship, no doubt, among teachers and students. And there are many dialogues happening in the hostels, also in culture classes. And it's very remarkable that when these dialogues happen, everybody is sitting in a circle, and there is a lot of opportunity for students to ask questions and everybody listening. And so there is something going on, but I feel that intellect is highly developed among students and teachers also. But intelligence is able, it means to see something non-verbally between the lines to understand. That is the root meaning, and it requires a silence. It requires the ability to be alone and observe not only nature, but what is happening within us, how these thoughts and feelings are arising. And there is one thing which I remember, Uma Akka, she was the first headmistress of Sayadri School. And in Sayadri School, like Rishi Valley School, they have Astachal. And during that time, all the students and teachers, they sit very quietly in the evening and look at the sunset. And also they look within themselves. So Uma Akka told me that there was one girl during this Astachal, she was observing two clouds. They are coming closer, and she thought that they will collide and there will be some problem. But she saw that these two clouds merge very effortlessly without any problem. And then she remembered that she had some conflict with another girl in the hostel. And she also learned that it is possible to live without conflict and merge with each other. And the birds, thousands of birds, they fly together and they don't collide with each other. So even the birds, they have some intelligence, and human beings also have this intelligence, but as we grow up and we acquire too much knowledge, bookish knowledge, and then that ability to observe everything non-verbally, that goes away. So Krishnamurti's teachings, if a person becomes deeply interested in looking within himself without any judgment, then there is a possibility to look at a tree or a human being and to live without conflict. And with this intelligence, the intellect functions very beautifully. But without this intelligence, intellect can be very, very harmful, can create a lot of conflict in relationship. And that intellect becomes very strong, I feel, even in our school, Krishnamurti school. And in spite of having many, many dialogues, that thing which Krishnaji wanted, awakening of intelligence, is very rare. And so I remember once Krishnamurti said that this schools, Krishnamurti schools, he said, these are first class ordinary school. That means the thing which he really wanted, that awakening, a different way of living without conflict, without creating problem, it has not happened. Okay, but there is a great potential, a beautiful environment is there, and there are teachers who are interested in bringing up with students, and people are sitting together and having dialogues. But important thing is that after this dialogue is over, our a person is really interested every day to look inside and learn from direct observation within oneself. Okay, I have said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harshad Bhai.
If I can make a brief response, I think that you've put everything together rather nicely, particularly that story from Oma Akka, which I've also heard when I interviewed her and Thomas Akka and Vasant Vihar. Quite a remarkable story. I think that in this area of, Krishnaji's expression that, these are first class ordinary schools, something like that you said. I think that there is a truth in that. There's also the truth in this, the metaphor of the clouds was very beautiful in that girl's story. There's a metaphor of the educator as gardener, and the gardener has to, take care a great deal for the soil and to, give loving attention to the ground on which the seeds will be sown. In some sense, in a fundamental sense, looking at the actuality of the schools, an appropriate way of thinking about the work in schools is that it's a kind of gardening. You prepare the soil with a great deal of affection, having understood the nature of the seeds and the potential that lies still hidden within them. And I think that in this ongoing work, Krishnaji's challenge stands like a great call from the wilderness, and perhaps that wilderness is too far away from us. But I think it is part of our passion for education to continue to relate with that call, even though in the actuality, as you say, you realize that the intellect tends to predominate and that the seriousness of the inquiry seems to not linger or go further in the life of a particular child who may on a particular occasion speak very sensitively and we make very perceptive remarks. Knowing all of that, I think the work of the educator is to continue to relate with all that, including the intellectual elements, including aspects of self-deception. And I think that the more there is that energy in a place to establish relationship without conflict, whatever the reality may be, maybe that is the key, because it is such a worldwide need now. If you look around what is happening, is extraordinary. It's all gone out of hand from in so many different dimensions. And it seems if there is just one thing that we can do, which is to plant the intention of living a life without conflict and still vibrantly engage with the reality as it is, then that is a thing that is perhaps of urgent need, and also in its own way a response to Krishnaji's challenge. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amresh. There is a written question in the chat box from Mr. Rajendran. Mr. Rajendran, would you like to ask yourself, sir? I don't see him yet. You want me to read it, Amresh? It's in the chat box.
I don't see, somehow, I have only 4 chat messages here, but I don't see any question.
There is one from Mr. Rajendran. I'll read it out to you.
Please.
A question to Sri Amresh Kumar. Hard work. Krishnaji said on the last day in Chennai, be very alert, make no effort. Is not hard work involves a motive, a goal or direction, or the observer? Is hard work required to be attentive, or to observe, or to be aware, or to be alert, or to self-knowing, or freedom, or to awaken one's own intelligence? This is his question.
Yeah, there are a number of things in that question, but perhaps what I could focus on is maybe thinking about hard work not in terms of effort at all, but the challenge of engaging with oneself, of being able to withstand the number of implications of one's own conditioning, including the feeling of loneliness. If, for example, as he has pointed out, if you just experiment with this, sit for 20 minutes without doing anything, that challenge presents itself. Now, is that one has to establish a relationship with that. And it is not with effort that relationship is established, but it is not also without not making having the right engagement with it. So I think the words hard work, effort, perhaps these don't capture the nuances that are actually involved in establishing right relationship with oneself, with people, with ideas, with things. And so it is worthwhile to carry these as questions and see what it means for oneself in one's own life, in one's own inquiries. That would be my response to that.
Thank you,
Part of
Amresh.
the question, at least.
Thank you, Amresh. We'll take the last question from Mr. Dinesh Waghmare. Yes, sir.
Are you able to listen to me, sir?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Sir, what I would like to say, you have talked a lot about not many things in your whatever you have addressed. But the basic today time has changed since Krishnamurti, and now today's challenges are very different. So, is it not high time to teach the students how to rather than going into the awakening of intelligence directly, the things like Maslow's need of hierarchy in the outer situation case, the transaction analysis which is covered in right now at the management level in the simple words to the students, so that they can tackle the outer situation as well as in the case of inner situation, how to improve on the emotional and how to understand the emotions, feelings, how to tackle fear, basic things, means fear, then greed and all the other aspects of the feelings and emotion. So they will automatically, and we should put the case rather than it's okay that you are providing security to them, but they should be told how to tackle the insecurity. So when you will teach them these things, they will be automatically in a position to tackle the other things which will be revealed in the life, real life. Because self-knowledge is not a static sort of thing. It is a rather the right word is self-knowing. So it will be, the challenges will be unfolding from time to time in different ways to them. The challenges will be different from time to time. What do you have to say on this?
Yes, I think I would agree with you that in many respects, the challenges of today have become more complex. For example, children are struggling much more with mental health issues. It is really quite extraordinary. It is not just a matter of this period of isolation during the pandemic. I think it may have other roots that people will probably discover as time passes. But in the school itself, we see that there is many of us are ill-equipped to listen to children, uh, to recognize that we need to give them time for individual conversations, maybe provide them, as you say, with certain kinds of tools or practices that will enable them to deal with their insecurities, their fear, anxieties. So the school, at least here where I am, we are waking up to this challenge. We have become more aware of these challenges in the last few years. And we may have to more actively pursue these skill building activities in school so that children can be drawn into certain kinds of daily, the possibility of taking up some certain kinds of daily practices. It could involve simple things like maybe some breathing exercises, for example, or journaling, or just sitting quietly, giving some thought to your next day before you go to bed, aspects of their daily life that may serve to ground the child. And sometimes the challenges may be rather complex. In those cases, we are, at least at this stage, forced to ask them to consult with their own counselors for assistance from them, because we are very much out of our depths in certain areas, particularly in acute cases of psychological distress. So what you're pointing out, I think, is a reality. I was making some reference to what has been happening in the West, but even agencies, organizations, NGOs in the country have presented similar findings of a vast increase in the incidence of anxiety and depression in very young children, as early as the age of 10. So we have to make sense of that and then learn
Sir,
to respond.
I would just share my experience. I have learned all these things like transaction analysis and Maslow's needs of hierarchy at a very later stage in corporate world. But I thought that if I would have learned this in my school days, it would have been helpful for me in a great way. Would have changed my whole psyche, or my looking at the things would have been different if I would have been taught that in the initial days itself.
Yeah.
And now today's what is happening, the world is flooding them various informations, various fake news, and various you know all those things. What is happening in the corporate world, what is happening in the media right now.
I think these questions are under active consideration in, I'm sure, many of our schools, and we will take them up in turn.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have come to the end, but I see Mr. Pradeep Verma hand raised. Pradeep, you please make a brief statement and then we'll close. Mr. Pradeep Verma.
Okay. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Okay. I have some very basic question. It may sound very naive also. What is intelligence that needs to be awakened, and how is it monitored, because intelligence is not personal? As long as mind decides what intelligence is, it's a thought. Then how teachers monitor the heart and mind versus mind only? Children. And of course, that metaphor, gardener's metaphor is very good. But then it depends on the gardener experience his attentiveness, and being in the present all the time. Thank you very much. If you can say something about these things, because I have been.
You got muted suddenly, Mr. Verma.
Is it audible now?
Yes. Have you completed your question? Would you like to finish?
My questions are simple and you have understood them. Because usually we use our intellect. The moment mind is used, intellect word comes, and then suddenly intelligence, they say, is not personal. How in others, so-called, and all those things. And heart and mind only, these things are as cloudy as ever, even after reading Awakening of Intelligence. Thank you.
Yes, I'll try to respond to the question as I have been able to understand it. I think you were asking what is the educator's relationship with the aspect of intelligence in the child. You use the word monitoring, but in my terms, if I were to put your question, it would probably involve asking whether the educator is in touch with the child enough to understand whether it is primarily the intellect or is it the head and the heart together. Perhaps something like that is the import of your question. And I think that while it is deceptive to look at any one particular moment and say, yes, you are experiencing the manifestation of intelligence or some such thing, I think that in the context of actual relationship is where you discover who you are. And the test of whether or not the head and the heart are together for yourself, it's not that you have to consciously test it in order to measure whether intelligence has been awakened in you. But the point is that whenever there is a conflict in relationship, that is when you realize that that's who you are. You are identified, or you are judgmental, you are reactive. There are tendencies and habits that are expressing themselves in relationship. And so it is in relationship that I might begin to understand the ways in which intelligence is not functioning, that there is conflict. And I may then begin to discover the nature of that conflict and where its roots might lie. And in this conversation and this exploration, rather than judging whether intelligence has been awakened or not, it is in the ongoing work with children that the real interest lies, I think. It does not matter very much whether intelligence has been awakened or not. We are after all not measuring that to what good will that of what good will that be. But if it is in the agreement with the questions, if the child persists and reveals out of their questions and feelings and intimations that they have understood something, then that is some indication of an insight in the child in the context of his or her life. So it's not monitoring, but I think a lot of conversations with children reveal their interest in their own life situations, their interest in their own suffering, their questions about the nature of suffering, their questions about the nature of attachment or comparison and so on. These are questions that often come up. But you are right that often enough, even the concerned or passionate or interested educator may notice that the student's interest in these questions is somewhat limited. And I think it's important to embrace that and say, well, that is, the child is not after all dedicated to you. And it's not that he has to come back with the question that you are going to be thrilled about. He's living his own life and a full life at that. And to the extent that you are able to establish a meaningful link and plant the seeds of a question well formed, then that is part of the ongoing work. And to nurture that kind of the embers of interest and keenness in the asking of questions to find ways of nurturing that, sustaining that. That is the work, rather than monitoring the outcome to sustain that work and to deepen it. Shall I stop?
Thank you, Amresh. I think we have come to the end of the session, and I want to thank Amresh once again for being with us today. And next Sunday we have Mr. S. Gopalan, who will be talking to us on the theme, why don't we start from the other end? The end we don't know about. So you're all welcome to join us next Sunday at 11 o'clock. These words. Thank you, Amresh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amresh. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Dubey.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kamlesh, please end it.